The wind never stopped in Wyoming. It howled across the empty plains, rattling the loose boards of Jacob Carter's ranch house and carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and loneliness. Jacob was 35, broad-shouldered, and weathered by years of sun and hard work. His hands were calloused from mending fences and breaking wild horses, but it was the silence that wore him down the most. The long winters, the endless chores, the empty chair across from him at supper. They had carved a hollow place inside him. That's why he'd written the letter. Not to find love, not to find beauty, just someone. A plain, practical woman who could cook, keep the books, and share the burden of this unforgiving land. He'd sent it to a matrimonial agency back east, describing himself plainly and asking for the same in return. Weeks passed. Then came the reply. Her name was Emma Foster, 24. Of modest appearance, the agency assured him, but of good character and strong constitution. She would arrive on the noon train the first day of spring. The morning of her arrival, Jacob stood on the weathered platform of the Cheyenne station, hat pulled low against the wind. The train's whistle echoed across the prairie, a long, mournful cry that seemed to reach into his bones. Steam hissed. Iron wheels screeched. The train slowed to a halt. Passengers stepped down. Merchants, drifters, a family with two small children. And then she appeared. Emma Foster was nothing like the woman he'd imagined. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight like fire. Her eyes, clear, green, and unflinching, swept the platform before landing on him. She moved with a quiet grace that made the chatter around them fade. Jacob's breath caught. This was no plain bride, and as she stepped toward him, suitcase in hand, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't expected in years. Hope. But in the shadows beyond the platform, a man in a black hat watched her with a gaze that was anything but welcoming. The ride back to Jacob's ranch was quiet at first. Emma sat beside him in the wagon, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless sweep of prairie. The wind tugged at the ribbon of her hat, carrying with it the scent of wild sage and distant rain. Jacob stole glances at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The way the sunlight caught in her hair, the calm steadiness in her posture. But beneath that calm, he sensed something else, a weight, a guardedness. "You'll find it's a hard life out here," he said finally, his voice low over the creak of the wagon wheels. "Not much in the way of comfort. Winters bite hard. Summers burn hotter than a stove. Neighbors are few and far between." Emma turned to him, her green eyes meeting his without flinching. "I didn't come for comfort, Mr. Carter. I came for a place to belong." The words struck him, not for what they said, but for what they didn't. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. The house stood sturdy but plain, its boards weathered by years of wind and grit. Beyond it stretched the corrals, the barn, and miles of open range. Jacob helped her down from the wagon. She took in the sight with a slow, deliberate breath, as if memorizing every detail. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Jacob had tidied as best he could, swept the floors, set fresh linens on the bed in the spare room. Still, the place felt bare, almost austere. Emma didn't seem to mind. She ran her fingers lightly over the mantel, where a single photograph sat. A younger Jacob with a man who looked enough like him to be kin. "My brother," Jacob said quietly. "Eli. He didn't make it through the winter 2 years back." Emma's gaze softened, but before she could speak, A sharp knock rattled the door. On the porch stood Hank Miller, the nearest neighbor, a wiry man with a permanent squint and a tongue that wagged faster than a windmill in a storm. "Evening, Jacob," Hank said, his eyes sliding past him to Emma. "Heard tell you were expecting a bride. Didn't figure she'd be—" He let the sentence dangle, his smirk saying the rest. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Emma, this is Hank Miller." "Hank, this is my wife." Hank tipped his hat, but his gaze lingered too long. "Well now, welcome to Wyoming, ma'am. Folks'll be mighty curious to meet you." When he finally left, Jacob shut the door harder than he meant to. Emma stood by the table, her expression unreadable. "They'll talk," Jacob said. "Out here they always do." "I've lived with talk before," she replied softly. "It doesn't scare me." That night, as the wind moaned around the eaves, Jacob lay awake, listening to the creak of the old house. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote yipped, answered by another farther off. But it wasn't the coyotes that kept him from sleep. It was the memory of the man in the black hat at the station, the way he'd watched Emma, unmoving as if he knew her. And in the stillness, Jacob realized something unsettling. Emma Foster had come to Wyoming for a reason, and he wasn't sure it was the one she told him. The next morning broke cold and gray, the kind of spring day that felt more like winter refusing to let go. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling around fence posts and the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods. Jacob was already outside, splitting kindling, when he saw Emma step onto the porch. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pinned up neatly, but there was something in the way she scanned the horizon, slow, deliberate, as though she expected to see someone out there. "Coffee's on the stove," Jacob called, setting the axe aside. She nodded but didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the far ridge, where the mist was thickest. Only when he stepped closer did she turn, her expression smoothing into polite calm. The day passed in a rhythm Jacob knew well, feeding the stock, mending a section of fence the wind had knocked down, checking the water troughs. Emma moved through the house with quiet efficiency, unpacking her things, sweeping, even baking bread. But every so often Jacob caught her pausing by the window, her gaze fixed on the distance. By late afternoon, Hank Miller rode up again, his horse kicking up dust along the trail. He dismounted with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Brought you some news," Hank said, leaning on the fence. "Word in town is a stranger's been asking about your new bride." Tall fella, black hat, mean look about him. Jacob's grip tightened on the fence rail. "You see him yourself?" Hank shrugged. "Didn't have to. Folks say he's been hanging around the saloon, keeping to himself. Don't drink much. Just watches." Emma had stepped onto the porch by then, her face pale. "What did he ask?" she said, her voice steady but low. Hank glanced at her, then back at Jacob. "Just your name, ma'am. Where you come from." When you got here, Jacob felt the air between them tighten, like the moment before a storm breaks. That night, over supper, Jacob tried to draw her out. "Emma, is there something you want to tell me about this man?" She set her fork down carefully. "There are things in my past, Jacob. Things I hoped I'd left behind when I came here. Things that might follow you." Her eyes met his, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw fear there. "Yes." The wind outside rose, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the dark, a lone wolf howled, the sound carrying across the empty land. Days passed, but the tension didn't ease. Jacob began noticing signs. A set of boot prints near the barn that weren't his. a fence post cut clean through as if by a sharp blade, the faint smell of cigar smoke drifting on the wind when no one else was around. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jacob saddled his horse and rode into town. The saloon was half full, the air thick with tobacco and the clink of glasses. And there in the far corner sat the man in the black hat. He was tall, lean, with a face carved in hard lines and eyes that didn't blink much. He didn't look at Jacob right away, just took a slow sip from his glass, then set it down with deliberate care. "You Carter?" the man asked finally, his voice low and rough. Jacob didn't answer. The man's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Tell Emma Foster she can't run forever." Jacob left the saloon with the words burning in his mind. The prairie night was cold, the stars sharp against the black sky. Somewhere out there, wolves moved in the dark, unseen but close. When he reached the ranch, Emma was waiting on the porch, her hands clasped tight. She didn't ask what he had learned. She didn't have to, because in her eyes he saw it, the truth she'd been holding back. And he knew that whatever past she'd tried to escape had just found them. The wind had been restless all day, carrying with it the smell of rain and something sharper, the scent of change. By late afternoon, the sky over the western ridge had turned the color of bruised steel, and the air felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jacob worked in the barn, oiling the hinges on the stall doors, but his mind wasn't on the task. Every sound, the creak of wood, the shuffle of a horse's hooves, made him glance toward the open doorway. He'd been on edge since the night in the saloon, since the man in the black hat had spoken Emma's name like a threat. Emma was in the house, but he'd noticed she kept the curtains drawn now, even in daylight. She moved through the rooms quietly, as if trying not to disturb something lurking just beyond the walls. By sundown, the storm rolled in. The wind howled across the prairie, bending the tall grass flat. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the land in stark flashes. Jacob was just about to head inside when he saw movement near the far fence line. A dark figure on horseback, watching the ranch. He froze. The rider didn't move, didn't call out, just sat there, a silhouette against the storm, until the next flash of lightning revealed the brim of a black hat. Jacob's pulse kicked hard. He stepped out into the rain, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. But when the lightning came again, the rider was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the sheets of rain. Inside, Emma was standing by the window, her face pale. "He was here, wasn't he?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jacob didn't answer right away. He pulled off his wet coat, hung it by the door, and met her gaze. "You need to tell me the truth, Emma." "All of it." Now for a long moment she said nothing. The storm rattled the shutters, thunder rolling like distant gunfire. Then she drew a slow breath. "His name is Silas Kane," she said. "I knew him back in St. Louis. He courted me. At first I thought he was charming, but there was darkness in him, Jacob. He was cruel, controlling. When I tried to leave, he swore he'd find me, no matter where I went." Jacob's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to tell me this before you came here." I thought if I came far enough, he'd give up. I didn't want to burden you with my past." Her voice cracked. "But I see now. I've brought danger to your door." The wind slammed a loose shutter against the wall, making them both flinch. Jacob crossed to the window and peered out into the rain. The land was empty again, but he knew Silas was out there somewhere, waiting. We'll deal with him, Jacob said finally, his voice low and steady. But you have to trust me, Emma. No more secrets. She nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes, not just for herself, but for him. The next day dawned clear. The storm swept east, but the air felt sharper, charged. Jacob saddled his horse and rode into town for supplies, keeping his eyes open for any sign of Silas. The streets were quiet, but the saloon keeper gave him a look that told him news had already spread. Your bride's past is catching up to her, the man said, polishing a glass. That fella in the black hat's been asking more questions. Folks are starting to wonder what kind of trouble's coming our way. Jacob didn't answer. He bought what he needed and rode hard for home. When he reached the ranch, the front gate was swinging open. His stomach dropped. He spurred his horse forward, heart pounding. Emma was on the porch, clutching a rifle. Her hands were steady, but her face was pale. He was here, she said. Silas. He rode up while you were gone. Said he'd be back tonight, and that you can't protect me. Jacob felt the weight of the words settle on him like a stone. Tonight. That meant the waiting was over. He looked out across the open land, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows. Somewhere out there, Silas Kane was coming, and Jacob knew the only way this would end was with one of them in the ground. The sun bled into the horizon, staining the sky in shades of copper and crimson. The prairie lay still, the air heavy with that strange electric quiet that comes before violence. Jacob stood on the porch, his rifle leaning against the post, his revolver holstered at his hip. Inside, Emma paced the length of the parlor, her hands twisting together. She had begged him to leave, to take her and ride hard for the mountains, but Jacob knew running would only delay the inevitable. Men like Silas Kane didn't give up. They hunted until the trail went cold, and Jacob had no intention of letting Silas live long enough to find them again. The first sign came with the distant thud of hooves. Slow, measured, a single rider. Jacob stepped down from the porch, boots crunching on the dry earth. The last light of day caught the figure cresting the ridge. Tall in the saddle, black hat pulled low, a long coat flaring with each step of his horse. Silas Kane. He reined in about 30 yards away, the two men staring across the open space between them. The wind tugged at Jacob's coat, carrying the faint smell of leather and gun oil. You should have stayed out of this, Carter, Silas called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. The girl's mine. Always was. Jacob's jaw tightened. She's not yours. Not now, not ever. Silas's smile was cold. Then you're a dead man. Emma appeared in the doorway behind Jacob, her voice sharp. Silas, stop this. You don't have to. Quiet, Silas barked, his eyes never leaving Jacob. This is between me and him now. Jacob's hand hovered near his revolver. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. The knowledge that one wrong move, one fraction of a second too slow, and it would be over. The wind died completely. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Silas moved first. His hand blurred toward his holster, but Jacob was already drawing. The crack of gunfire split the air, echoing across the empty land. Silas staggered, a look of shock flashing across his face before he crumpled to the ground. His revolver slipped from his grasp, landing in the dust. Jacob stood still for a moment, chest heaving, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging between them. Then he holstered his weapon and walked forward. Silas lay on his back, eyes fixed on the darkening sky. Blood spread across his shirt, but his voice was still edged with venom. She'll never be free of me. Jacob crouched beside him, his voice low and steady. She already is. Silas's breath rattled once, then stilled. When Jacob turned, Emma was standing at the edge of the porch, tears streaking her face. He walked to her, took her hands in his, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she let herself lean into him fully. "It's over," he said. She shook her head slightly. "No, it's just beginning." And she was right. The danger was gone, but the frontier was still a hard, unforgiving place. There would be droughts, storms, and long winters ahead, but now they would face them together, not as strangers bound by a letter, but as two souls who had chosen each other in the fire of trial. That night, the wind returned, softer now whispering through the grass. Jacob sat on the porch with Emma beside him, the stars bright above the dark land. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in threat, but as part of the wild, eternal song of the West. Jacob glanced at Emma, her face lit by the glow of the lantern. She met his gaze and smiled. A small, quiet smile, but one that carried more promise than any words could. And in that moment, Jacob knew. He had asked for a plain bride to share his burdens. Instead, he had found the love that would change his life forever.